today we're focusing on the whole concept of private equity in Africa as more and more investors within and outside the continent start seeing the continent squarely as a new frontier market. Harith is a Pan-African development fund focused on infrastructure, and the CEO, TshepoMahloele, is our guest tonight. Tshepo, thank you very much for coming through. The bugbear in Africa is infrastructure. People say there's minerals, you have enough talented people to drive industry, but you just don't have the infrastructure. And this is the space you're playing in. This is where you're directing a lot of your money. You've identified 25 projects across Africa with a project value of $24 billion US. How are you going to direct that towards infrastructure?
First of all, Rato, the truth is, for why we're focusing on infrastructure. Maybe let me tell you about, 4 years ago in 2006, when we started, raise $1 billion and try to start tackling, the continent's, infrastructure backlog. So what we realized then was that, when we looked at the continent and its shortcomings and why are things just not happening, and also we looked at some of the successes we had, with South African infrastructure, and the question was, nothing, is gonna, maybe take root or succeed on the continent until we get the infrastructure built, until people can trade, until people can communicate, until we can get goods to the market, until the costs of transportation are not 30% more than anywhere else in the world. And that's maybe what sort of made us focus on this thing, and because we had achieved some successes in the South African space. And the figures are much more higher than that. The continent needs in total, at about $93 billion of infrastructure investment per year. But that's both in maintenance and, public sort of infrastructure investment and private sector infrastructure investment. And maybe I would say perhaps about a third of that, would be needed from the private sector. Right. And we try to play in that space. And we've, gone to some of the larger investors, focused on the continent and said, there's a whole lot of projects which can be done, providing very good returns, and the other thing we did was that it was the first 15-year fund on the continent. We sort of said, no, Africans, need to start taking a longer term view of the continent. And why some of the projects were not happening and why infrastructure is not being built is that there's, it needs a longer term outlook. You cannot get in and out within a 7-year cycle. And that's why the whole focus on that sector.
What do you make of people who say providing infrastructure is a public good? It is the responsibility of the government. It is not the responsibility of business. And when business starts to build roads and electricity pylons, they are creating a situation where governments abscond from their responsibility to taxpayers. What do you make of PPPs?
I think if you look at the way the world has changed right now, what we believed in, let's say, a couple of years ago, you can see in the West, you actually have governments starting to even play a much more proactive role, even in the public markets. We believe that Africa, in terms of where it is right now, it does need that help. The private sector needs to also come in and help governments in terms of where they could with some of the, there's some of the social infrastructure and there's some of the economic infrastructure which the private sector can take on and start addressing alongside government. So it's not just the private sector thing. These are partnerships, bringing all sorts of government coming in with the, with the concessions, with the regulation and all that, and the public and the private sector coming with the capital to build that infrastructure in a manner that is responsible, that takes a long-term view on the continent. So you need all sorts of manners in terms of saying how do you address the current challenges that the continent has. One of saying you cannot, it's just a public sector domain. I think we can argue that, to even the Thatcherites or years and all that and getting out of that. But the reality is right now we need all sorts of capital on the continent to address that need. And unless the private sector comes to, the private sector has the capital. It can take the view. why not utilize that capital?
All right, where are you directing your energies? Because in countries like Nigeria, and effectively all three leading economies, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, the biggest infrastructure shortcoming is energy, electricity. And we're seeing governments launching bonds to try to raise money for the sector. But we're not really seeing the private entities, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. We're in the renewable energy era, and this is where independent power producers can come through. But the capital expenditure that's needed for investing in energy is not commensurate to the tariffs that are being paid by consumers. So you have a disconnect. So there is a sense that it's a much needed area to invest in, but it's not profitable. And yet it's capital intensive. And to that end, let's leave it to the state. How do you navigate around the issues around a lack of incentive and yet a very real pressing social need to sort out what could be the biggest impediment to doing business in Africa?
First of all, I think energy as a sector, we think it's profitable. We have invested in it and we continue to invest in it. I think where you find challenges of bringing projects to market on the continent has been with, there are these mega projects. For one, perhaps ESCOM can do the major projects like Midupi and all those type of projects. But the other smaller economies cannot carry those size projects. And that's where perhaps, even as a fund, we have invested in an independent power producer called Aldrich, International. And as a fund, we actually own a large chunk of that. And we have said that independent power producers should start focusing on your 100, 200, 300 megawatts sort of like power projects, because those are coming to the market much easier, as opposed to waiting for the mega projects which take much longer to put together, need a much higher level of regulation to get to market. But we're finding a very nice sort of like space to play in the renewable space. We're looking now at the project in Kenya. It will be the largest wind power project on the continent. Close to 300 megawatts, driven by the private sector. And we're hoping that our independent power producer company will be able to participate in it. And that's where we're seeing activity. We're seeing the same thing in Ghana, with power plants of about 100, 150 megawatts. So that's where we're seeing a lot of activity, and we are very much more upbeat about that. And as those brings some of those projects quicker to market than perhaps some of your mega projects. And as the mega ones happen, I think they'll find us ready to also participate in those.
Your views on the new frontiers, and I'm talking here about the new oil producers, Ghana and Uganda coming on stream next year, countries like Ethiopia that are growing above 7%, also with the second largest population in Africa after Nigeria, countries like Mozambique that have no minerals but have done so well in economic reforms to create a mining economy, tourism sector, countries that other people are looking interested into as they try to diversify their approach away from the big guns.
I think that's exactly what makes the continent an exciting place to be in right now. I mean, it's exactly that. What happened, let's say 7 years ago, you'd say, I'll only invest in this, 1, 2, 3, 4, economies or countries. Today, people say these are the 4 economies that I will not invest in. That's a total, change of view and everything. And we are upbeat about what's happening in Ethiopia. How the government there is starting to tackle some of the issues, albeit coming off a very, low base. But then, you have 3% telecommunication penetration, and with a very large populace. It's a market waiting to happen. Mozambique, 1994, when the N4 was built, it was regarded as the poorest country in the world. You go to Mozambique today, it is changing, and that's the view we take of the continent and of Africa. And we're saying, in 5 years' time, it will definitely be better than today.
All right. Yeah. And just finally, for an investor watching you right now, interested in coming into Africa via private equity, if you could sum up this continent, what would you say?
I think it's a continent whereby right now, the possibilities are many in terms of what is possible, in terms of like, getting involved in tangible, hard sort of like, projects which can make a difference while making you a very good return. I mean, we have seen a study made by even the World Bank in terms of like, what average sort of like returns, private equities are achieving on the continent in this, day and age whereby like, you're getting very low, below 5% like returns in the West. In Africa, you're getting in excess of 20% in dollar terms. I think that's the place to be. I mean, there is, and it will drag on for a long time. For the next 40, 50 years, we will still be needing to build certain infrastructure. So where else would you rather be than where there's all that action and which is tangible? And but besides that, it's starting to make a real difference in terms of what we are doing. It's making a difference. People are now starting to get connected. Telecommunications rates are coming down. People are starting to get electricity. People are starting to get water. It's on a slow pace, but as we said, like, it's gonna, in 5 years' time, it will definitely be better than today.
All right, changing the world.
We hope
Building
so.
Africa today for tomorrow. Thank you very much to TshepoMahloele, who is the CEO of Harith, the Pan-African Development Fund. And we thank you at home for watching this edition of Captains of Industry.